Yeah, I know. It's been 2 months. It's been a while since I put up the last video. Fantastic for channel growth, you know? That's what the algorithm loves, just fucking inconsistent posting. Since I put out the Pixie video, people have been asking me to cover their favorite monster. It seems like Galley, Golem, and Hare are the most popular ones right now, and I'll get to them eventually. But today's video is about Zuum, and for a very good promo-related reason, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Zuum was actually introduced in Monster Rancher 2 as the IMA counterpart to FIMBA's famous Dino. But to be honest, that's sort of where the similarities end. Dino's techs are all about hitting as hard as possible while still being relatively balanced, whereas Zuum is all about hitting as hard as possible while also still being relatively balanced. They're not really that different. They're mostly the same monster. Dino and Monster Rancher 1 serves as an easy-to-raise, beginner-friendly monster that allowed you to start building up your ranch with little effort. Zuum was supposed to be this as well, but as many people have tried and learned, grabbing a Zuum from the market as your first monster isn't always a recipe for success. So why is that? Let's take a trip back to the Jurassic period, the 1990s, and find out what makes Zuum tick. Zuum from the get-go has an easy-to-understand archetype. It's the all-rounder. Wyola even says so. It excels at nothing in particular but has no real weaknesses. It even has an average guts rate of 13. But we know that numbers can be deceiving, especially in Monster Rancher, where there's so many different variables, and while your mileage may vary, the most statistically average monster is actually a Zuum. So much so that Zuum Mach is sort of like this game's version of Ditto when it comes to combining. You can always finagle your way into a great combo with it, meaning that these monsters are often raised for combo fodder. There are more well-rounded monsters with higher overall stat gains across the board like Mochi, but due to the ludicrous math behind combining, sometimes these higher stat growths make things complicated when they shouldn't. But I digress. So back to Zuum. Well-rounded, check. No weaknesses, sorta check. Easy to raise? Yes. Maybe? There's a few reasons why Zuum is often kind of awkward to raise as your first monster on the ranch. Firstly, his basics kinda suck, so right out of the box it's kinda hard to win tournaments with him and start making money. Its lack of a specialty often leads to option paralysis in new players who decide to raise all stats equally. Mission complete! And even if you don't do this, Zuum has trouble finding its footing early on in life, and if you're short on cash and need to enter tournaments, you'll see this in full effect. A lot of the attacks you can acquire for Zuum early on are actually some of his best, so this helps alleviate the struggle, but I suppose you need to know what you're doing first to take advantage of that. Zuum has 24 techs. That's a lot of techs. That's the most amount of techs. Only 3 monsters in the game have 24 techs, and the others need crossover techs to fill all these slots. At 6 possible techs per slot and 4 slots, 24 is the most the game possibly allows, and Zuum's got them all. Now before I get into the techs, I want to mention how to acquire techs in a bit more detail since people had questions after the Pixie video. I think that seemed misunderstood was that you actually do need to go back to the specific errantry location and go on a second errantry after you've used the tech enough times to get the next move in the chain. There's also other requirements such as nature and your monster's stats, and each tech has its own priority listing, so sometimes you'll get certain moves easier than others. It's way too much to talk about right now, so I'm going to link to the tech acquisition calculator, and you can figure it out on your own. I'll be doing a video on this eventually, but this is not the time and place. As I alluded to earlier, Zuum's starting techs are not fantastic. Claw is as basic as you can get on a basic tech. 50% chance to hit, just enough force to not be ranked as E. No withering and no boost to your crit, no damage output, and not really accurate. This move has no real competitive use unfortunately, or casual use either really. Tail is also not great, but it's far better than Claw. A little bit more damage, significantly more accurate, and 5% more chance to crit for only 2 guts. In single player casual play, you really only ever want to use Tail if you're forced to use one of the basics, and in competitive play, it also doesn't have much use either. But thankfully for Zuum, this is where its issues with his basics end. His tech chains spawning from Claw and Tail are actually very cost efficient and make up the bulk of his foundational loadouts in competitive play. Million Claws is a pretty solid low damage chip tech that is so inexpensive that you can spam it. It won't win you games on its own, but you can rely on it. Claw combo is the last tech in the Claw chain, and this theoretically at least is the tech you should always be using in slot 1. It's nothing special, but it's just a very good middle of the road tech with no obvious weaknesses. Where have I heard that before? In this respect, Claw combo is one of the defining moves of Zuum's intended archetype. It does it all, just not spectacularly. The Tail tech chain is actually more of a tree, as it branches out into 2 different techs. Playing Diablo 2 now, baby. Tail combo requires 24 uses, while Tail Lash requires 30, meaning you'll always hit the requirements for Tail combo first. Thankfully, it's not actually classified as a basic tech, and is instead a hit tech. So if you want Tail Lash, you can get it by just not going to the hit tech errantry. This is Zuum's only hit tech, so if you don't want Tail combo, it's easy to avoid. But Lash is a weird tech. It costs more than Tail Combo despite being worse numerically. It's just worse, and it really seems like a bizarre oversight. It's less accurate, it's less powerful, no boost to crit or withering, and it still costs more. So would there ever be a reason to get Tail Lash? It's objectively obsolete. Well, while Tail Combo is the end of its fork on its side, Tail Lash can chain into one more additional tech. Tail Lashes is pretty similar to Claw Combo, slightly more expensive for a bit more damage and accuracy though. Having both Claw Combo and Tail Lashes can help add even more consistency to Zuum. You can have essentially the same solid tech in the first 2 slots. But if safe and boring isn't the gear you like to play in, then I'm pleased to tell you that Zuum isn't just a 1-gear monster. He's a 2-gear monster. Got 2 speeds. Fight and its upgraded forms are classic heavy techs. They do a lot of damage for how much they cost, but you have to deal with their terrible hit rates. For only 18 guts, I think you can justify the -9 hit on Bite. It's pretty quick animation and it is spammable. It's similar to Pixie's Flame, which we talked about in depth in the last video, but is a little bit more consistent to make up for the fact that Pixie can build up her meter way quicker than Zuum can. Medium risk, medium reward. Missing Bite won't lose you the game, but landing it can put you on the front foot pretty quickly. Million Bites is more the same, being a bit riskier in terms of accuracy and cost, but in return you get up damage and withering. The withering boost isn't super noticeable as the animation is so much longer, meaning your opponent has a longer window to build up retaliatory guts, but at least it stops you from falling behind too far if you do land the hit. Bite Throw is power-based Zoom's main option for nuking its opponent. Heavy damage and up to 24 guts withered for only 32 cost can be absolutely game-changing at any point in the match. It's not an accurate tech by any means, but if you've already got the first 2 techs in this chain, you're probably a gambler to begin with, so I don't think you're bothered by that. Some monsters can build a cheap tech loadout that doesn't do a lot of damage, but instead patches up this weakness with high critical hit rates. Zuum can technically do this too, but mostly if your goal is losing.
Your
tech loadout.
It's very meat and potatoes, Liz.
Oh, thank you.
No, it just means you don't have anything rare in there.
He doesn't have anything exceptionally special, and crit-based monsters are among the rarest and most specialized, so naturally his sharp techs are not particularly noteworthy. Actually, you know what? I lied. The Jumping Claw line is pretty noteworthy for being Zoom's worst tech chain. Jumping Claw is an expensive basic tech, basically, with a decent chance to crit. Without the crit, the move really doesn't feel like it's worth it. While a crit can add 50% damage, you're hoping for an otherwise unlikely burst of offense that doesn't even really make up for the weak numbers otherwise. Diving Claw is mathematically the exact same move, just with slightly higher risk and slightly higher reward, so it's also nothing special. But Zuum does a forward momentum backflip here, which is fucking sick. The thing is though, that this move in particular isn't actually terrible. None of Zoom's techs are irredeemably bad, and Diving Claw doing almost 50% more damage than its predecessor makes it shine a bit more brightly. Even when the cost to value ratio is the same, sometimes it's worth investing in a bigger tech. A crit Diving Claw is still not absurd damage output, but it's enough to steal games occasionally for about 47% chance to hit. Aerial Claw is the end of this tech chain and is actually a special tech, so you get it from Korea and not from the Papa's errantry. It costs about 12% more than Million Bites for a +6 chance to hit and 25% less damage, so on paper this sounds super bad mathematically. And it's honestly not great at first look. But with the Fame and Bad Natured Stress bonuses, you have nearly an S-Force tech 40% of the time. This makes Aerial Claw a pretty solid burst damage option some of the time, but even without a terrible hit rate, it's still inconsistent because you need that crit. But while the Jumping Claw chain is lackluster at times, Zuum does have a second chain of sharp techs you can pick up, and they are a bit better. Charge is pretty similar to Diving Claw in cost and values, but it has different utility. Almost a full second quicker to animate and situated in the 4th slot, Charge is a strong opening tech. The -6 hit here can be a bit dicey, but considering the move only costs 24, it differs from a lot of other slot 4 openers in that a miss won't cost you the game. The 40% crit on this move gives you a weak B-Force tech for 24 guts, which can set you up for success early on. So Charge is a pretty solid opening gambit, great. But let me tell you about its big brother. Fire Charge is the moneymaker. It's available on the very first frame of a match, it does a decent amount of damage and withering, has an astronomical critical hit rate, and it only costs 30 guts. It's a tad inaccurate at only 42% chance to land a hit, and its animation is notably slower than Charge, but honestly this can be forgiven for having a pretty solid nuke for only 30 guts available right away. Fire Charge isn't Zoom's best overall tech or anything like that, but the thing is that even with -8 hit, it's fairly consistent since landing a hit withers for so much that not getting a critical roll doesn't neuter the usefulness of the move like it can with Charge. I really can't overstate how much value the withering of this tech adds. On landing Fire Charge on the first frame of battle, you put yourself in a position where you've done a considerable chunk of damage, or maybe only 10 guts behind your opponent by the time the animation ends. Lots of slot 4 moves have little withering and open up the user for a counterattack. Fire Charge neutralizes this threat. As an aside, I actually spent some time a few months ago trying to figure out why so many sharp techs seem more expensive than they were worth. The way the game calculates how much a sharp tech should cost seems to hover around this formula. Note that this is not actually the same equation as how to find effective force or anything like that, it's just some other random bullshit. But I tested it against a bunch of monsters and it seems pretty consistent, with outliers appearing when a tech is either exceptionally accurate or inaccurate, or when a move does a lot of withering. One of the hardest things in competitive play is figuring out what makes a tech good or bad, and the answer is an unsatisfactory context. But you can use this equation for a quick litmus test against sharp techs to see if they're worth using or not to get the ball rolling if you're struggling on your choices. Zuum has 2 more power techs, we're not done yet, the Roll Assault Chain. This is easily one of the worst 50 guts techs in the game. It's 10 more effective force and 10% more accurate than Fire Charge for 20 more guts, which okay, 10 plus 10 equals 20, cool, the math checks out. But it doesn't really. The amount of withering it does is the same as Fire Charge, except you'll have wasted all your guts landing the hit in the first place, meaning you'll probably have a 30 to 40 guts deficit after landing the hit. As we know, having more guts than your opponent gives you the bonus known as Guts Correction, which boosts your offense and defense. You can watch episode 2 in the Rancher Rundown series for a detailed breakdown on Guts Correction because I'm not getting into it again here. The thing is that the damage Roll Assault does is probably not going to instantly win you the match ever, but giving your opponent an enormous guts advantage is a great way to lose the match. Roll Assault's utility is limited to finishing off your opponents with a burst of damage after they've already been sufficiently weakened, but as a first attack it can really set you back even if it does land. Think of Monster Rancher as a turn-based game. If you attack, most of the time you end up at a guts deficit, allowing your opponent to use a counterattack until you're back up to 45 guts. If you can do a decent amount of damage and also steal your opponent's turn through withering them out, that tech has a lot of usefulness at all stages of battle. Roll Assault's not one of those techs. Roll Assault has niche use as a counterattack if your opponent misses their big bomb in slot 4, but AI versus AI doesn't really allow you to plan for stuff like that. Roll Assault chains into Burning Roll, which is still overpriced but not nearly to the same degree. The almost S-ranked force and heavy withering more than make up for the additional 5 guts cost and 4 less accuracy. 55 guts is also an interesting breakpoint because it means you can't actually use this tech right off the hop and will need to build 5 guts at the beginning of the match first. This also helps patch up its lackluster hit because it gives your opponent a chance to attack first, giving you the guts advantage. Because of this, it fills the same counterattack niche as Roll Assault, but it completely outclasses it in both the amount of damage you do and the control you have over attacking second. Zuum has an interesting mix of intelligence techs as well. While most power-based monsters tend to have their intelligence attacks relegated to only withering or something like that, Zuum keeps living up to its jack-of-all-trades moniker with a lot of different options on the intelligence side. But, we're gonna start with the withering anyway. Hypnotism is a strange tech. It's very cheap and does a respectable amount of withering, but it does so little damage, and even Fairy Saurian doesn't have a fast enough guts rate to really rely on consistent low damage withering. This move is not going to win you any games. But if you like more drastic numbers in your withering column, you can instead go with Dust Cloud, which is actually probably worse. As a rule of thumb, if you're spending this many guts on a tech, you're usually expecting it to give you some sort of mid-level advantage. But the only advantage Dust Cloud gives you comes into play if you're already winning and are trying to lock your opponent out of attacking. It actually does a debilitating amount of withering, but it's not ever going to put you ahead if you're losing, and that's often a much more important quality than increasing a lead you already have. But like I alluded to, it's not all withering with Zuum's intelligence techs. It's actually mostly not. Fireball is a heavy tech that is almost identical to Million Bites, just on the intelligence side. It has the potential to do some serious damage, but it's just not super accurate. It's a standard heavy tech. Fireball chains into Jumping Fire, which is slightly more expensive and riskier than Fireball. You trade a couple of points in accuracy for a small boost to withering and a significant one to force. For me, this is where the hope of high damage potential doesn't really feel congruent with the risk involved anymore though. 37% chance to hit is really spooky, and I wouldn't want to rely on it, but it is stronger than all but one of Zuum's power techs, so it's not like the damage is something you can ignore. Jumping Fire chains into Fire Breath, which is a special tech, but functions very similarly to Jumping Fire. It's actually one of the cheapest special techs at only 37 guts, and has small boosts to force withering and crit over Jumping Fire. It's essentially the same tech, and it has all the same uses, it just packs a little more oomph for a little more cost, making it inherently more risky. 5 Balls doesn't actually chain from the Fireball line anywhere, and it's a standalone tech you can pick up by itself. While not a top tier tech, it does serve its purpose as a risky opening gambit. It does serious damage and a solid amount of withering, but the 40% accuracy can't be overlooked. Again, this tech is very similar to Jumping Fire and Fire Breath numerically, so you can fill up multiple slots with variations of the same tech if you're looking to be able to nuke from multiple ranges. By now, you're probably noticing a pattern where Zuum's intelligence techs are all risky damage options. But I know you're saying 49 force on Fire Breath? It's nice, but can Zuum do any better than that? Does he have a secret weapon? Well, my friend, he does. Let me introduce you to Firebomb. This is your nuclear option, and I do mean nuclear. 59 force is fucking stupid. It is so much damage. There's only a handful of techs in the entire game that do more damage than this. But when you factor in the 45% crit rate, it's more than enough to kill any monster from full health. You can even delete a full tank build in a single hit given a guts lead. This is just an astronomical amount of firepower, and it does a ton of withering as well, meaning that should they survive by the grace of God, Firebomb is still going to make sure they're feeling it. It also has a weird quirk where on missing, it moves Zuum almost 2 entire attack slots forward, meaning the options your opponent has to immediately counterattack are different from those they have available on Roll Assault or 5 balls. Against some monsters, moving away from the 4th slot really dampens what they're able to counterattack with, but some monsters actually have their scariest options in this range, so it's a matchup dependent thing. It's also possible both monsters will just walk backwards into the 4th slot again regardless, but this may be a niche optimization to consider based on who you think your opponents will be. But it's got a couple of big downsides. Minus 15 hit is incredibly bad, and the tech actually has a recoil attached to it as well. Recoil techs are weird because they have their own force number for recoil, which does not equal the force that they do to the opponent. It essentially ends up being an attack you do to yourself based on your attacking stat and your defense. The higher your offense and the lower your defense, the more self-damage you will do. But the recoil for Firebomb is actually only 15, meaning the damage you can do to yourself varies randomly between 1 and how much damage Million Claws could do to you at max. While hurting yourself for trying to attack isn't a non-issue, this really isn't a lot of damage. And if you're already gambling on this shit, I don't think taking 150 to 200 damage is going to deter you. It is the nuclear option after all, and you'll win and lose by using this tech. It's a hell of a way to play Monster Rancher. So, you know, that's a lot of techs and a lot of info. Building Zuum can be a daunting task, but honestly though, there's not actually a lot going on, even though, you know, there's a lot going on. Unsurprisingly, the best Zuum is the one with the fastest guts rate, and Fairy Saurian, Aloha Saurian, Hound Saurian, and Zebra Saurian all cap out an 11 guts rate, meaning they build 1 gut every 11 frames. As Zebra Saurian is not able to get any additional battle specials like Grit, and it starts off with Dust Cloud, you're probably better off using the other 3 though. As for tech loadouts, here's your main options. This is what I consider the best build for Zuum in the game, and it's actually one of my favorite overall builds in general. There's so much utility in this loadout, and any tech at nearly any point in the match can be seen as a good call. I love it for AI vs AI because it's pretty self-reliant. You haven't set your monster up to make any bad decisions. You could also go with something like this if you can stomach more risk though. It does pay to go all in sometimes. I would still advise against getting the Roll Assault line regardless, but you know, I'm not your mom, you do what you want. The thing about Zuum's intelligence build is that all of the attacks are interchangeable, so it's really Rancher's choice on this one. 5 balls versus Firebomb for how much risk you want, Fireball by itself versus upgrades for much of the same. You'll get the Withering techs just to cover up Tail, but they're not going to win you any games on their own. This ends up being an extraordinarily expensive build with no cheap, reliable options, so it's very much an all or nothing regardless of whatever techs you do pick. In the 4-stat meta, Power Zuum is a solid mid-tier character. But just like you'd assume from being an all-round type monster, he doesn't really excel in any meta. I don't have a ton of first-hand info on Zuum for the 2997 Japanese meta, but I think if I were to run a build in that, I would just do the first build I showed, with the basics and fire charge. Intelligent Zuum carves out a small niche as an anti-tank powerhouse, but this isn't really a niche in the sense that other monsters aren't capable of doing the same thing, but more so a niche in the sense that it does exceptionally well versus one type of build and struggles versus others. This is the closest Zuum comes to being specialized in any sense, and it's still a very common and reproducible specialty, so I'm not sure if it even counts. He's a strong, dependable monster, just like the game says. He can win tournaments occasionally, but lacks what it takes to be a consistent champion. In hard mode, however, Zuum was given plenty of other options for builds due to a heavy rebalancing of both his key techs and his less useful ones. And well, I'm actually really stumped on what Zuum's best build is in hard mode. That's why I'm hosting the Oops All Zooms tournament on June 27th, to see what you guys can come up with. There's a link to the rules in the hard mode 1.0 changelog in the description, so read up on the numerous changes and pick your favorite one to duke it out in this all-raptor beatdown. I just want to take a moment to give a quick shout out to everybody who watches these videos, everybody who comments, everybody who follows the stream, subs and follows that as well. It means the world to me. COVID kind of destroyed my industry, so I'm still waiting to get back to work, and I've been doing this to kill time in the meantime, and it's been a lot of fun, and I'm really happy that people seem to be enjoying it. I've been enjoying it. I really hope it doesn't take me 2 months to get the next video out, but you know, hopefully you guys are still sticking around by the time I put out that one. My focus right now is still the stream. You know, these videos are not easy to put together, but the stream still takes even more work than this does. If you're not following yet, you should come hang out in the channel. I did some studies. Turns out you'll be about 20% cooler if you do. You know, it's not a big gain, but it's something, right?